This is going to be a very brief explanation of the essay by Friedrich Nietzsche, which is called The Genealogy of Morals. If you do find me to be helpful, then please do subscribe to my channel. Now, without wasting more time, let's get started. Nietzsche claims that humanity does not know itself, that humanity does not understand itself. What Nietzsche wants to do through his work called the Genealogy of Morals is to explore the history of morals, to understand where they originate from and how they evolve over time. Nietzsche also wants to know if these 19th century European conventional ideas of good and evil do any good for humanity. As in, do these conventional ideas of morality allow the 19th century Europe to strive and progress? He believes that it does not help out in any way. Now, let's talk about the first essay of this work. In the first essay, Nietzsche looks into the concepts of good, bad, and evil. He starts up by rolling up his sleeves to the British psychologists at the time. And he partially agrees with them that yes, we are not born with morals embedded within us, and that rather we develop them. We learn these morals. However, the British psychologists also think that we found selfless behaviors to be useful in early societies and that it became ingrained in conventional ideas about morality. But Nietzsche disagrees with that. Instead, what Nietzsche does is that he looks to the word good, and he finds that this word called good in early periods of time actually meant noble. What this word called good references to is quite shocking to say, because he finds that it refers to the people who are the powerful people of society. In other words, it is those with power that are able to determine what is good. For example, if we look at ancient Greece, in the early societies, there was no concept of evil. People who were not strong or powerful were just simply less good, but they were not fundamentally evil or anything, they just were less good. If we look at societies that were once ruled by knights, warriors, dictators, and the sort, we find that those societies tend to think that being aggressive, ambitious, strong, straightforward are actually good things. Now, in regards to priestly morality, as the name says, priestly morality, Nietzsche thinks that such a morality evolves from oppressed people, from the oppressed masses that existed from the early birth of, Christianity. These oppressed people hated their oppressors, and so they started to revolt, and they started to code up a new moral code that projects their own humble, patient, and obedient characteristics and paints it as a good behavior. And then they flip the tables, because now the ones that oppress them are seen as barbaric, uncivilized, and evil or aggressive beasts of prey. Nietzsche sees such a revolt as a dangerous thing for European society. He says that he smells bad air that comes from the people who are not moving forward, that are not truly living but rather rotting. People are miserable. They think they can choose not to be violent, to be submissive and obedient, but in truth, they just misunderstand human nature. These people that hold what many would call a weak value system think that if they remain powerless here, that they will be powerless there up in the heavens, where they will have bliss and all those sweet honey things and 72 virgins and whatnot. But to Nietzsche, this is false. He believes that scholars should study the value of these morals within society and actually think about what they are good for. And then in the second essay, Nietzsche looks at promises. He claims that in order for us to keep promises, we have to train our minds. We need to develop a conscience that allows us to be guilty for breaking these promises, because it helps us to be able to keep these promises. So we like to think that developing such a conscience is a good thing. But Nietzsche claims that these social customs just make people develop a conscience that is dipped in pain, fear, violence, that circle around the notions of debt and credit. When I say debt and credit, I don't mean the financial terms. I mean becoming indebted for breaking the promise that the creditor expected, or in other words, Nietzsche argues that when a person who is the debtor breaks a promise, they fail to deliver that promise too. So they owe a debt to that person that expected to, of course, receive that promise, and that person is the creditor. The debtor is then entitled to punishment, and the creditor can then claim compensation from the punishment, and they get that compensation through physical pain that the debtor must go through. The creditor feels satisfied watching the debtor suffer until the debt is paid off. Nietzsche says that this satisfaction that is met through being cruel is a natural human instinct, and this explains why historical festivals may also include such violent parts to them. Nietzsche claims that humanity was in a better position when people were not so ashamed or let down about this aspect of human nature. Nietzsche turns to his face to justice. He thinks justice is also like this, that it's about collecting these debts. You know, when people in a society make a promise to behave in certain ways, such as to not murder, bully, steal, lie, cheat, or do illegal things, then they also develop a conscience. So when these people break these promises that they owe to society, then they must undergo punishment, right? For example, I've made a promise to society that, I won't steal, I won't murder anyone, and if I was to do that, then obviously the masses will want to see me get punished for it, right? When these people break these promises that they owe to society, then they must undergo punishment. The creditors can claim compensation by making these criminals pay for their crimes through some form of pain. This desire to watch the criminals suffer gives satisfaction to the masses. Nietzsche thinks that earlier societies were better because they had outlets for people to express their aggression, and then they were able to feel their satisfaction. People do not need to use some legal system to make criminals suffer to get that satisfaction. Nietzsche also thinks that customs do not actually get better over time either, because it depends on who is in power and how they shape these customs to achieve their aims. Nietzsche thinks that punishment in European society does not help the cultural aims. People like to think that punishment teaches people to feel guilty about breaking laws, and that by being guilty they will not repeat these things again, and that by doing so, these people become, successful later, which I find it to be quite irrational, to be honest, and I agree. Nietzsche thinks that guilt is an unhealthy thing. I think we need something more new, something where humans can, obviously improve and understand, these things are wrong, they should not do it. Of course, morals, having a moral system is very necessary, right? We can't have people out on a rampage and stuff. But I do wish that we had some sort of new system where we can teach people, where people can have a lesson, right? Whether it's capital punishment or something else, we can talk about that in another video. But of course, sorry, I'm sharing my stupid opinion. Let's go on. According to Nietzsche, Asian humans were nomadic. They would use their aggressive instincts to kill prey. Later on, they formed societies and began to direct that aggressiveness towards conquering lands. Now, modern society does not have that external place for us to be aggressive. Now we take it out on ourselves. We have repressed that instinct. We have covered it up and we hardly show it to anyone but ourselves. We torture ourselves with guilt. We have a big problem in our minds. Unhealthy thing that causes us to suffer. And if we look at Christianity, it just amplifies this suffering even more, because it tells us to tame our animal instincts, to control our urges so that we can be good. And then they develop a fixed thought that these human instincts are evil, and because of that they suffer even more. So Nietzsche hopes for a change. And then in the third essay, Nietzsche talks about ascetic ideals, and then these ascetic ideals, basically they tell us to abstain or to withdraw from emotional, bodily and material urges in order to practice poverty, modesty and humility. Nietzsche wants to see where these ascetic ideals come from, how they come up, especially how they do so in European society. And he sees these ascetic ideals in Wagner's art, because Wagner's art later on, obviously, it advocated for things such as modesty. Nietzsche likes the poetry of Hafiz, for example, though, because he liked the poetry of Hafiz, though. Sorry, I'm totally stumbling. Nietzsche likes the poetry of Hafiz because he tends to focus on the conflict between the sensual and spiritual aspects of life. And then Wagner's work was also like that in earlier times. But Nietzsche finds that Wagner's later work is just bad. Nietzsche looks at Kant's view about art and calls it idiotic, because Kant, he thinks that we need to maintain an emotionally and psychologically distanced attitude to appreciate the beauty in art, which Nietzsche obviously finds to be nonsense. Nietzsche agrees with the writer Stendhal, though, where he claims that art has great power and that it is able to move people and stimulate them. Nietzsche also thinks that these ascetic ideals are also prominent in most intellectual practices in European culture. If we, for example, look at the philosophers, even the armchair philosophers or just the philosophically inclined people, if you understand what I'm talking about, you'd find that they tend to enjoy thinking, and they think that they must live a quiet life and avoid the distractions of everyday life. Philosophers think that by being away from these distractions, avoiding life to think, that they will have a more objective view of the world. But Nietzsche does not agree with that. And he says that they are always looking from their own subjective perspective. Nietzsche also calls people who find values in distancing themselves from everyday life as ascetic priests. Nietzsche claims that the ascetic ideals is mostly prominent in Christianity. Religious leaders want to escape this pain of mortality, and they tell themselves that if they withdraw from their emotional urges, materialistic aims, and bodily desires, then they will have access to immortality in heaven. And Nietzsche thinks that this is an irrational way to look at things and that it makes European society sick. Ascetic priests put themselves as leaders who will heal people's suffering. And this position makes them feel powerful, which decreases their own suffering. But at the same time, they encourage people to turn their aggression on themselves and to feel guilty for having these natural human urges. And this makes people suffer even more. Nietzsche says that in other cultures, spiritual people have and utilize a lot of discipline to abstain from life in order to move beyond these emotional experiences and to feel a blissful sensation of nothingness. But Nietzsche thinks that Christian ascetic priests do the opposite. Instead, the Christian ascetic priests control people's behavior by telling them to act charitable and kind and in certain ways, and they also fire up the masses' emotions by making them feel passionate about the Christian moral code. This, to Nietzsche, encourages mass hysteria. Even scientists think that they have escaped the ascetic ideal, but they have not, because they still follow that thought that they need to step back from living to have a more objective view of our world. And they are just like philosophers, like how I explained it earlier on. They tend to do the same thing. They tend to stay away from many urges and prefer, of course, intellects. The ascetic ideals have such an influence in European culture that Nietzsche claims that he smells the bad air from the rotting corpses of people who are not growing in their lives because they keep on stepping back from living. Sure, European society might have grown more secular over time, but it has moved on from Christian dogma. But the Christianity morality still drops off it. It's still leaking out of it. It is still being dipped in that Christian morality. Nietzsche understands that there is a question that haunts mankind, and that is, what is the meaning of life? The ascetic ideas are irrational. On one hand, it makes people feel like they have a purpose or an aim in life, and then on the other, it makes people feel guilty. It makes them hate their own human instincts. It makes them suffer and desire nothingness, right? And I'm pretty much done here. We are done here. I hope you have enjoyed this and that you have learned something new. Until next time, my people, and have a good day or night. And remember, I love you. Thank you.